My name is Bill McKeever. I'm the founder and director of Mormonism Research Ministry. We're based in the Salt Lake Valley in Utah. And I'm going to be speaking on Joseph Smith's polygamy legacy, as you can see from the title here. And as we delve into this topic, I'm sure some of the things might shock some of you who have never looked into this before. But I'm going to go back to more of the beginning and answer some questions as to why polygamy in the first place, because I've heard a number of reasons from Latter-day Saints as to why they practice polygamy. There's really no one consistent answer that you will find when you talk to Mormons. They all have sometimes a different idea as to why the origins of it. But I'm going to be citing primarily from Mormons, either Mormon leaders. And of course, if you're going to delve into polygamy in the beginning, you have to go back to the second president of the Mormon Church, which would be Brigham Young. So I'll be citing him a lot. But I'll also be citing some church manuals, some church historians, basically quoting from their own sources. And this is one thing that we often do at Mormonism Research Ministry. We found that we're most effective if we're citing their own material rather than citing critical material about the LDS people. So anyway, let's look at this book. This is written by a Mormon historian by the name of Richard S. Van Wagner. He died a few years ago. He wrote a book called Mormon Polygamy, a History. And on page 212, he says, "To those who accept Joseph Smith as a prophet of God, plural marriage can be evidence of his divine calling. To those who question or reject his prophetic claims, polygamy is more readily explained as evidence of his downfall." So you can see the difference of opinion regarding where you are concerning Joseph Smith, what you're going to think about him regarding this very controversial issue. And it was controversial even during Joseph Smith's time among even his own followers. Well, the question is why plural marriage? When I go through the Beehive House, which is where Brigham Young lived with one of his wives, most of his wives, or many of his wives, I should say, lived in the Lion House next door to the Beehive House in downtown Salt Lake City. One of the reasons I hear when I ask the tour guides, young missionaries, well, why did Brigham Young practice polygamy? And I'm going to talk about the reason that I've heard many times from some of the tour guides, but this is what Brigham Young said. He says, "Why do we believe in and practice polygamy? Because the Lord introduced it to his servants in a revelation given to Joseph Smith, and the Lord's servants have always practiced it." "And is that religion popular in heaven?" he asked. "It is the only popular religion there, for this is the religion of Abraham, and unless we do the works of Abraham, we are not Abraham's seed and heirs according to promise." What he's basically doing is he's pointing to the Old Testament, and there's no doubt polygamy was practiced in the Old Testament. However, what makes polygamy in the Old Testament much different than polygamy in Mormonism is in Mormonism, it's looked upon as a commandment of God to get the best from God. In the Old Testament, it's more tolerated by God. There's never any place in there that is ever commanded, even though the Mormon Church tells its people it was commanded. There's no reference for that. You have to go to a unique Mormon source to get that kind of a conclusion. But this is what Brigham Young said as to why the Mormons practiced it. When he talks about the religion of heaven, we can kind of piggyback off of what Brigham Young said, and this is a statement made by Mormon apostle Orson Pratt in a book that he wrote called The Seer. Well, I should clarify that. It really wasn't a book. They've compiled a bunch of his writings that were under the title of The Seers. It was Seer. It was a periodical, and they've compiled those, and now you can buy the whole series if you'd like. But on page 179, Orson Pratt said, "We have also proved most clearly that the Son followed the example of his Father and became the great bridegroom to whom kings' daughters and many honorable wives were to be married. We have also proved that both God the Father and our Lord Jesus Christ inherited their wives in eternity as well as in time." So what we're basically hearing is that, well, this is what God the Father is doing. And if God the Father is doing this, and Jesus also did it, then why shouldn't we be doing it? So they're merely following a pattern that Mormons are led to believe goes clear on, I guess you could say, pretty much into eternity past. Now, polygamy didn't all of a sudden come into play in the Mormon church. It came in very slowly, and Joseph Smith, as you can see from this quote that I'm going to cite you from a book called Mormon Enigma, Emma Smith. Emma Smith was Joseph Smith's first wife, and she never liked polygamy. There were times when she seemed to go along with it, but I think those times could probably be more regulated too when Joseph Smith was trying to convince her that it was more for eternity and there was no physical relations going on. Maybe at those points she might have gone along with it for a while, but Emma Smith pretty much never really liked this concept, as you can probably understand why, But in this book, which is an excellent book, and I would recommend if you want to get an idea of what early Mormonism was like, but more from the view of Joseph Smith's wife, this is an excellent book that I would encourage you to read. It's Mormon Enigma, Emma Hale Smith, written by two Mormon ladies, Linda King Newell and Valine Tippett Avery. Now, on page 96, this is what they say. They say, early in the summer of 1841, it says, however, Joseph publicly tested the water for this new order of marriage. One church member, Joseph Lee Robinson, heard the speech and later recorded it in his journal, adding, "This was to me the first intimation that I ever received that polygamy would ever be practiced or lawful with this people." His brother, Ebenezer, later wrote of Don Carlos Smith's reaction. Now, Don Carlos Smith is a brother of Joseph Smith. And this is what he is recorded as saying. "Any man who will teach and practice the doctrine of spiritual wifery," which was a kind of a derogatory term regarding plural marriage, "will go to hell. I don't care if it is my brother, Joseph." So you can see that this notion of practicing plural marriage was not readily accepted by a lot of people in the early Mormon movement. And so you can understand also why Smith would be very cautious and not just all of a sudden make a public announcement on this. Because it was very controversial, especially when you look at the Book of Mormon. Now, the Book of Mormon is considered to be scripture, according to the LDS Church, but yet the Book of Mormon, surprisingly, probably for some, does not teach the concept of plural marriage. But it's a little bit confusing, that's for sure. It condemns it, but there's a loophole in the condemnation where it can possibly be practiced. And this is found in Jacob 2:24 through 30, the beginning part of the Book of Mormon, where it reads, "Behold, David and Solomon truly had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. For there shall not any man among you, save it be one wife, and concubines he shall have none, for I, the Lord God, delight in the chastity of women. And whoredoms are an abomination before me. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, wherefore this people shall keep my commandments, saith the Lord of hosts, or cursed be the land for their sakes." And now here's the loophole. "For if I will, saith the Lord of hosts, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people. Otherwise they shall hearken unto these things." So what we find in the Book of Mormon, as if God should desire at any time in history that there needs to be an increase in the population of Latter-day Saints, he can reverse himself on this and then command, apparently Joseph Smith, we think at this time, to say that polygamy would be okay. Now, there's an interesting idea behind that, because first of all, why would God command that there needs to be the practice of polygamy to increase the population when, think about it, children are a burden, usually at least till they're 18, and they move out on their own, unless they're millennials, and they'll be perpetually living with their parents, But normally, they tend to move out. But for many of those early years, children are quite a burden. They are a burden on a family. There's no doubt about it, if you've ever had kids. So what would happen around 18 or 20 years down the road that God would all of a sudden say something like this? So there's a lot of questions that are raised about this, but I think the biggest question that we can raise is this. If this is the only loophole for the practice of plural marriage, and that is to raise up seed, well, did Joseph Smith do that? Did he raise up seed? Did he have children through these polygamous relationships?
But well, the fact, his wife he didn't.
Well, there's no evidence that he did. You're right. There's no evidence that he had any children from these relationships. Now, this is from Brian and Laura Harris Hales. Brian Hales and his wife Laura are Mormons, and they've written a number of articles and a book on the subject dealing with Joseph Smith's plural marriage. There's even a website that they have, josephsmithspolygamy.org. Under the common questions section, you'll see this. No children are known to have been born to Joseph and his plural wives. There are rumors of children, though. It is possible that some were secretly born and then raised by other families and carried other surnames. However, after the saints arrived in Utah, there would have been little motive to keep the paternity secret. Any child of the prophet would have been given special attention and perhaps have been looked upon as a legitimate future leader to counter the claims of Joseph and Emma's sons who had remained in Nauvoo. Now that's a reference to Joseph Smith III in particular, because Emma, when Brigham Young moved out west, Emma Smith did not like Brigham Young at all. Brigham Young did not like Emma at all. So when Brigham went west, Emma stayed in Nauvoo. And she raised her children in Nauvoo, and that's where the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had its birth. It's now known as the Community of Christ. But Brian and Laura Hales make a very good point. Even though polygamy was secret during the Nauvoo period, when they got out west into Utah, there would be no need to be secret about it anymore. In fact, any offspring of Joseph the prophet, as he's understood by Latter-day Saints, could have, they probably could have been looked upon as 19th century rock stars because they were related to Joseph Smith by blood. But we see no record of this. We see nobody held up to that kind of esteem in 19th century Mormonism. There's, again, no record that Joseph Smith had any children through this. And that would be the only loophole, according to the Book of Mormon. Now, Todd Compton, a Mormon historian, wrote a book called In Sacred Loneliness. And it's a very controversial book, probably not so much now, because the Mormon Church in recent years, and I'm going to talk about that a little later on, has pretty much come clean on Joseph Smith's plural marriages. But Todd Compton kind of led the way. He was one of those that started talking about this before the church started admitting it openly, where he says on page 15 of his book, In Sacred Loneliness, 18 of Joseph's wives, or 55%, were single when he married them and had never been married previously. Another 12%, were widows. However, the remaining 11 women, 33% of his plural wives, were married to other husbands and cohabitating with them when Smith married them. If one superimposes a chronological perspective, one sees that of Smith's first 12 wives, 9 were polyandrous. You're not going to find anywhere in the Book of Mormon, or the Bible for that matter, or the Doctrine and Covenants, or the Pearl of Great Price, where polyandry is ever talked about or commanded. And yet Joseph Smith was, in fact, by this statement that you see here, and now the church has admitted it publicly as well, that Joseph Smith did, in fact, marry women who had living husbands. And there's evidence of that, no doubt. Now, I might mention, if I remember correctly, Compton tends to go by the idea that Smith maybe had around 33 plural wives. I think that's the number he chooses, yes, correct? Okay. The church has come out recently and admitted that Smith could have had as many as 40 plural wives. I don't know who those extra women are, because when they mention that, they don't give any names. So I'm not even familiar who they might be. I'm sure if I read some of the names, I'd probably recognize them, but I've never seen the church ever put all 40 in any type of a list for us to look at. Now, one of the questions that comes up, and I hear this on the streets when a Mormon finally can't evade the fact that Joseph Smith did have plural wives, they'll usually say, yeah, but he never had sex with them. It's funny, they have no problem with Brigham Young having sex with all sorts of women, but Joseph Smith, no, he didn't have sex with any of these plural wives. There's no evidence to support that either. In fact, you have Richard Lyman Bushman, in his book, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, on page 439, as the marriages increased, there were fewer and fewer opportunities for seeing each wife. Even so, nothing indicates that sexual relations were left out of plural marriages. So here we have a Mormon historian denying this notion that many Latter-day Saints, I'm sure, would like to have, that Joseph Smith didn't have any sexual relations with any of these women. Yes?
My question is, if he didn't intend to have sex with them, then why have so many?
That's a great question. And the question would be more of a relationship if he was sealed for time and eternity. He would be they would be his spouse in eternity. And being connected with Joseph Smith as a type of Mormon royalty is a big deal in early Mormon circles. Yeah, that's a great question, though. Now, you cannot study the subject of plural marriage in Mormonism without at least a subheading called Lies and Deception. Because from the very beginning, Joseph Smith and those who were privy to what was going on with Joseph Smith were constantly deceiving the people regarding this practice. As I mentioned, it was very controversial, certainly during that time period in the early Mormon years. And there were a lot of Smith's close contemporaries that were not too happy when rumors started circulating that Smith was doing this. Well, in the book Mormon Enigma, Emma Smith, on page 112 and 113, and you'll see I have ellipses here, those are mine. They write, the demand for secrecy coupled with the need to warn others of unauthorized practices led Joseph and the 12 apostles in Mormonism, to develop a system of evasion. By employing code words, the practitioners of the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, as taught by Joseph Smith, felt they could publicly deny one thing and privately live by another, and do it with a clear conscience. This is how they would get away with this in their own minds. And it's kind of like the question I hear a lot from Latter-day Saints or ex-Mormons. They'll say, well, is the leadership aware of a lot of these things in Mormonism, and how do they live with themselves on this? How do they sleep at night? I'm sure they convince themselves that what the Mormon church is doing as far as making good people better people, and this is how they argue it, that makes it okay. And I'm sure some of these leaders have to realize a lot of what they believe, or what the people believe, they may not believe it now, but it's based on a lie. But as long as you're making good people better people, that seems to make it okay, I'm sure, in the minds of a lot of the leadership. But I would also venture to say that a lot of the leaders probably know this thing is all bogus. They have to. I mean, they have access to the same things even more than we have access to. And if they are rational people at all, they're going to have to know that there's something seriously wrong with Mormonism. Back to the book by Richard S. Van Wagner, Mormon Polygamy, A History. He says on page 51, Smith's denials of polygamy were accepted at face value by most saints, but Emma so strongly suspected her husband of practicing it that she enlisted support from other anti-polygamy women to keep track of him. She's got her own friends watching out for Joseph Smith. Now, there's a lot of irony in this because Joseph Smith made his wife the head of the Relief Society. It was a women's auxiliary in early Mormonism, and they still have it to this day. And what's fascinating, when you read the book Mormon Enigma, there's a section in there that talks about the Relief Society and how Emma was trying to quench rumors that her husband was messing around. Okay, let's put it nicely as best we can. And here's the irony. The women that she is talking to in the Relief Society, many of them are the reasons for the rumor. And Smith never says anything to his wife about it. So this is what irritates me about Joseph Smith, is that he basically puts his wife through a public humiliation, never tells her, really, that he's betting some of the women that she's actually talking to. And so you can see what an embarrassing situation it would be for his own wife, because the women that are responsible for these rumors are right in front of her. Some of them are probably even close friends at the time. Well, we go on. We have Brigham Young, where he said, admit for argument's sake that the Mormon elders have more wives than one, yet our enemies never have proved it. If I had 40 wives in the United States, they did not know it and could not substantiate it. Neither did I ask any lawyer, judge, or magistrate for them. I live above the law, and so do this people. Do the laws of the United States require us to crouch and bow down to the miserable wretches who violate them? No. You see, in Utah, which is separated by several hundred miles from the rest of society in the United States, we're kind of like a law unto themselves. The church ran everything. It's not quite so bad nowadays, but still, we do have in our government in Utah, the Mormon church carries a lot of influence. And it's not that the church has to stick its nose into every piece of legislation in Salt Lake City. They don't have to do that, because many of the legislators are Mormon. They already know what's expected of them. They know what the church would probably want regarding a certain bill. So the church doesn't really have to stick its nose in a lot of the things that go on in our state. Well, let me show you this. This is from the Doctrine and Covenants, section 101. This is the 1835 edition. It was reprinted as section 109 in the 1866 edition and in the Liverpool edition. And this is what it says in this area right here. It's kind of hard to read, so here's the text. Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again. Now, what's interesting about this is the date, 1835. As early as 1835, accusations were circulating that polygamy was going on. So much so that Smith feels inclined to come up with a response to it. Doesn't that seem a little bit odd? Well, it's almost like when Joseph Smith even first gets married, there's rumors of him and his infidelity. And so these things are going on and on. Now, why would these kind of rumors circulate? It's the usual, well, if there's smoke, there's probably fire. Something's going on here. And Smith seems to be having to fight these accusations throughout his entire lifetime after he gets married to Emma Smith, and that was in 1827. Well, so you can see this is another deception. What's interesting is in 1866, when it was printed, okay, in the Liverpool edition, 1866 happened to be the date when Brigham Young was teaching that the only men who become gods or even the sons of God are those who enter into polygamy. And I'll show you that quote later on. Well, on December 16th, 2013, the Mormon Church came out with what was known as a Gospel Topics essay addressing the issue of plural marriage and families in early Utah. The Mormon Church was really forced into doing this because so much information was going out on the internet regarding the teachings and history of the LDS Church that it was causing a lot of concern, not just among those who were outside the Mormon Church, but those who were members of the Mormon Church. And a lot of members were wondering what's going on here. We keep reading the same thing on all these, critical websites. And so the church kept putting it off to the point where it was no longer able to do so effectively. The information age has changed everything when it comes to the Mormon Church. And they can no longer cover this stuff up anymore. And they cannot make excuses and just tell people, well, you just need to go pray about it. Go read your Book of Mormon and pray about it. That's not working anymore. So they started coming out with these essays that were tackling some of these very controversial issues. And they came out periodically, not necessarily in any particular order, I don't think. But in 2013, they came out with this essay. It doesn't even look like this anymore. This is the way it looked originally. It was called Plural Marriage and Families in Early Utah. Well, we're going to look at this paragraph that's taken from that essay. And I want to go through it in a few chunks here. At the very beginning, you can see in yellow where it says, during the years that plural marriage was publicly taught, All Latter-day Saints were expected to accept the principle would be plural marriage, as a revelation from God. Not all, however, were expected to live it. Indeed, this system of marriage could not have been universal due to the ratio of men to women. You have to understand that Mormonism was kind of, it was a pioneer religion, okay? And so a lot of the people, you had to go to Utah. Since you're looking at it, I should be going to this direction, okay? They had to go to Utah. Well, usually in the pioneer age, a lot of those were men. A lot of women didn't do that. Though women did, but it was mostly men. So it would make sense that there would probably be a preponderance of male members and not female. That's a big argument, because one of the reasons I hear when I go to the Beehive House, which is where Brigham Young lived, and I ask, well, why did Brigham Young practice polygamy? More than once I've been told, well, because of the persecution that the Mormons faced in Illinois, there weren't that many men. And so these women needed to be taken care of. My rebuttal question is why do you have to marry them to take care of them? Right. They don't know, okay? Well, God commanded it is usually the response I'll hear after that. Now think about that argument for a minute, though. Because of the persecution that the Mormons faced, there were more women than there were men, and so these women had to be taken care of. How many men do you think died during the persecution period in Mormonism?
Not many.
Not many. In fact, I've done a lot of research on this, and the most I can find, the most that I hear that could have died during that time, maybe 100 men. 100. Now, certainly persecution, that's bad. What's that?
From persecution or just dying?
From persecution. From persecution. And maybe 100 at the most. Now think about this. 100 men would cause this big, huge social upheaval to where polygamy has to be reinstituted. This would be during the time when in the 1860s, we just came through a huge civil war with over 600,000 casualties. Nobody ever thought to change the social mores over that. And there were a lot of men missing as a result of the Civil War. So this argument that there were more women than men because of the persecution, it just doesn't make any sense. But this is a common rumor, a common idea that we hear among many Latter-day Saints. And I've heard it personally. Well, anyway, let's go on here. What about this ratio of men to women? First of all, the stats don't bear it out. It just does not bear this fact out. This is Mormon Apostle John Witzow, and he wrote the United States Census records from 1850 to 1940 and all available church records. Now notice what he's citing here. Census records and church records uniformly show a preponderance of males in Utah and in the church. Indeed, the excess in Utah has usually been larger than for the whole United States, as would be expected in a pioneer state. The births within the church obey the usual population law, a slight excess of males. He goes on, Orson Pratt, this Mormon Apostle Orson Pratt, writing in 1853 from direct knowledge of Utah conditions, when the excess of females was supposedly the highest, declares against the opinion that females outnumbered the males in Utah. And he's citing from Pratt's book, The Seer, page 110. This is from John Witzow's book, Evidences and Reconciliations, page 391. So that argument is not supported by actual statistics. Again, it's another rumor that Mormons are known to circulate to try and excuse the practice, but the facts don't bear it out.
When you're talking about the excess of females, that's not in Utah. That's
in Utah. We're talking because that's where the church was at this time. The church basically moved.
There were more men than women. Is that what it says?
Yes, there was not an excess of females.
Oh, okay.
Okay, there were more men than women. Now let's look back at this paragraph from the statement, the essay. Church leaders viewed plural marriage as a command to the church generally, while recognizing that individuals who did not enter the practice could still stand approved of God. Okay, well, let's look at some statements. Here's that quote that I was telling you. by Brigham Young. Notice the date, 1866. The same year the Liverpool edition of the Doctrine and Covenants was being printed over in England, denying that they were practicing polygamy. This is what Brigham Young is teaching in the United States. I should say the Utah Territory. The only men who become gods, even the sons of God, are those who enter into polygamy. So there would be a consequence if you didn't enter into polygamy, especially if you were told to do so. Brigham Young also said in 1873, this is August 31st, you can find it in the Journal of Discourses, volume 16, page 166. Now, where a man in this church says, I don't want but one wife, I will live my religion with one, he will perhaps be saved in the celestial kingdom, which is the top level of Mormon heaven. But when he gets there, he will not find himself in possession of any wife at all. He has had a talent that he has hid up, going back to one of Jesus' stories. He will come forward and say, here is that which thou gavest me. I have not wasted it, and here is the one talent. And he will not enjoy it, but it will be taken and given to those who have improved the talents they received, and he will find himself without any wife, and he will remain single forever and ever. So yeah, you could remain single, but in the eyes of Mormon doctrine, Brigham Young, the president at the time, you're going to be punished for that. So yeah, you have the option, but there's going to be a consequence for choosing the wrong option. Now let's go on. What about the women? In that same paragraph, it says, women were free to choose their spouses. Yeah. Whether to enter into a polygamous or monogamous union, or whether to marry at all. Some men entered plural marriage because they were asked to do so by church leaders, while others initiated the process themselves. All were required to obtain the approval of church leaders before entering a plural marriage. Yes?
I have another question. You made a statement earlier, and I just thought about it. I think you said that the reason why they married all those women is because women needed to be taken care of.
Correct.
When in these times, wouldn't a woman stay at home until she got married?
Well, the problem, though, would a woman stay at home until she got married? Probably, but the argument is that they needed to get married and there weren't enough men.
Gotcha.
Okay? That would be the argument that they would use against that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, let's look at this statement here. Okay? If they have that opportunity for women, whether they want to enter into it or not, what did Brigham Young say about that? Well, he said this. This is in the Journal of Discourses, volume 16, page 166 and 67. Again, I think it's that same message I was quoting earlier, August 31st, 1873. But if the woman is determined not to enter into a plural marriage, that woman, when she comes forth, will have the privilege of living in single blessedness through all eternity. Now, sisters, do not say, I do not want a husband when I get up in the resurrection. You do not know that what you will want. I tell you so that you can get the idea. If in the resurrection you really want to be single and alone and live so forever and ever and be made servants while others receive the highest order of intelligence and are bringing worlds into existence, you can have that privilege. They who will be exalted cannot perform all the labor. They must have servants, and you can be servants to them. So yeah, here's what's going to happen. Yeah, you have a choice if you want to remain single or you want to remain with only one man who has one wife. Yeah, you have that choice. But again, there's going to be a consequence. You're not going to be able to bring worlds into existence, and that's the object of many Latter-day Saints, is to rule their own world as their God rules this one. But it says that they're going to need, these who are going to be able to do that are going to need servants, and that's going to be your job throughout eternity. Because you didn't do what you were supposed to do, you will be servants to them. So in other words, to a Latter-day Saint worldview, you're going to be punished for this. And they understood that. They understood that quite well. So to say that they had all this kind of freedom, technically you could say they did, but that freedom, quote unquote, came with a serious consequence. Now, there came a point in early Mormon history where the United States government begins targeting those who are practicing the new and everlasting covenant within the Mormon Church. In 1862, the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act comes into effect. This is right at the beginning of the Civil War. Moral was a senator. I think his name was Justice Moral. I think he was from Vermont. And it was signed by President Lincoln, and it banned plural marriages. Now, Lincoln was in the middle of a huge conflict, as you can understand, in 1862, the war between the states, and of course, being here in New Orleans, it would be the War of Northern Aggression, I think is how they would describe it. He had other things to worry about. So what happened was there was kind of a deal made with Brigham Young that even though polygamy was considered technically outlawed, Lincoln would not enforce it as long as Utah stayed out of the conflict. And that's basically what happened. Utah was over here, and they basically didn't get involved at all in this. And so that was fine during the Civil War period. Well, then we have the Reynolds versus the United States case in 1879. Now, the war is over, and now attention is now being put back on Utah and the practice of plural marriage. In this case, this was George Reynolds. George Reynolds was a polygamist. He was a test case by the Mormon Church because the Mormons felt that because polygamy was a part of their religion, they should be free to practice their religion. But the Supreme Court at that time didn't look quite that way at the practice, because religion was understood in the minds of our lawmakers at that time as being more the Christian religion. And polygamy was not considered part of the Christian faith. So the Supreme Court didn't really see that as being protected. So Reynolds was found guilty. Then we have the Edmunds Act of 1882 that declared polygamy a felony and revoked some civil rights of polygamists. And then we also have the Edmunds-Tucker Act, there we go, of 1887. Same guy, Edmunds, working with a guy named Tucker now. I think Tucker was a congressman, Edmunds was a senator, and so they put together this law, and as you can see, this one really starts to hurt them. Prohibits the practice of polygamy and dissolved the corporation of the LDS Church. It allowed for the federal confiscation of all church properties valued over $50,000. So now the Mormon Church is under a lot of pressure. They're threatening to dissolve the church if they continue to do this. And so what happens? Wilford Woodruff, the fourth president of the Mormon Church, this is a picture of Wilford Woodruff, even though there's a lot of bravado going on at this time, and even from Woodruff himself, look at this statement from Wilford Woodruff, December 12th, 1869. Do away with that, then we must do away with prophets and apostles, with revelation and the gifts and graces of the gospel, and finally give up our religion altogether and turn sectarians and do as the world does. Then all would be right. We just can't do that, for God has commanded us to build up his kingdom and to bear our testimony to the nations of the earth, and we are going to do it come life or come death. He's speaking of polygamy. That's the context. And there were a lot of statements made by Mormon leaders at this time that they were never going to give up polygamy because polygamy was commanded by God, and we cannot give up this and disobey a command from God. Well, notice this is 1869. A lot of things start changing during this time when these laws start coming forth, and now they're going to be starting to be reinforced. Well, Wilford Woodruff is basically forced into coming up with some agreement with the United States government, so they come up with what is known in Mormon circles as the Manifesto. The Manifesto is found at the end of the Doctrine and Covenants. It's not even classified as a revelation with the other revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's more of a press release. And even though we are led to believe that Wilford Woodruff had this revelation regarding this manifesto, I've never read the revelation. I don't know where the revelation is even located if there was a revelation. I don't know. But nobody's seen it. But he comes up with this statement. And if you read the manifesto, it sounds like a press release. That's basically what it was. Well, here's what happened as a result of this. The government returns confiscated property on August 25th, 1893. Confiscated real estate is returned on January 4th, 1896. But the manifesto itself merely promises that plural marriages would no longer be solemnized. It's just a promise, which they're not going to keep. And it did not nullify previously solemnized plural marriages, nor did it prevent new plural marriages. What happens after the manifesto is polygamy still is being solemnized in Mormon circles. Again, it goes back into being secret. They're not talking about it publicly. And in many cases, the way the Mormons felt they could get around it is they would go to Canada, like Cardston, Alberta. That was a polygamous community. Or they would go into Mexico, where the federal government could not touch them. And this is where Mitt Romney comes around, because his ancestors go to the polygamous groups down in Mexico. That's where his ancestors are from. So this is what happens. There's a change in Mormonism at this time. Well, because it's still going on, and the federal government starts hearing about all this, naturally, they're not convinced that the Mormon church is really sincere. So a lot of things happen. There's a guy by the name of Reed Smoot who was elected to Congress, to the government, and before he's seated, there's a lot of questions about Smoot and the Mormon church and its practice, to where finally the Mormon church has to come out with a second manifesto in 1904. What I affectionately call the Now We Really Mean It manifesto, okay? And Thomas G. Alexander, in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, wrote this article called To Maintain Harmony. It's volume 15, number 4, pages 50 and 51. There's this quote: between the manifesto of October 1890, ostensibly ending new plural marriages, and the second manifesto of April 1904, when President Joseph F. Smith, the sixth president, strongly interdicted the practice, members of the 12 and the First Presidency sanctioned and performed various marriages both in the United States and abroad. So there's an admission here that was still going on, but basically the manifesto of 1904 is where the Mormon church starts to get serious about this. And this is when they start excommunicating members who are still wanting to practice plural marriage, who feel that this is still a commandment of God, regardless of what the federal government says. Now, a lot of these names probably won't mean much to you, but these names like John Woolley, Lauren Woolley, Kingston, Broadbent, Barlow, Musser, in Utah, those names still exist. I mean, you still see their ancestors, still practicing polygamy in a lot of areas. Then we get down to some of the more infamous ones, like Rulon Jeffs, Warren Jeffs, who's doing time in prison right now with the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This legacy still goes on in the state of Utah. So, and I might mention here, you'll see a note I have here, that this movement, this new fundamentalist movement as it's come to be known, it's not monolithic. It's not monolithic at all. A lot of these groups are very separated, and they have their own leaders, but there's a number of what they call clans in Utah of these polygamists. And you do see them every once in a while. Like you go to a Walmart on a Saturday night, you'll see some of these people. They sometimes dress very uniquely. Guys are usually maybe in overalls, and the women have very long dresses, very high collars, certain hairstyles and such. So you do see them in Utah. And it's kind of interesting, and tourists probably don't really recognize it all that much. Maybe they do, but they are there. Their presence is there. There's no doubt about it. Well, anyway, this movement starts coming up, and it's causing a lot of embarrassment for the Mormon church, because if you don't know much about Mormonism, one thing you probably will know about Mormonism is they practice polygamy. So how many times are Mormons being asked, oh, you live in Utah, how many wives do you have? Ha, ha, ha. Mormons don't think that's funny, okay? They really don't. And because this has been an embarrassment to them, they're trying to shed that and trying to look normal as they possibly can. They're just normal people wanting to be gods, And and then to have this polygamy attached to them is sometimes an ugly stigma to many Latter-day Saints. So much so that Gordon B. Hinckley, who was the 15th president of the church, get them all mixed up. We're up to 17 now. Gordon B. Hinckley, as you can see in the Mormon Newsroom, which is an official website of the LDS Church, he said, President Gordon B. Hinckley stated the following about polygamy in the church's October 1998 General Conference. I wish to state categorically that this church has nothing whatever to do with those practicing polygamy. There is no such thing as a Mormon fundamentalist. It is a contradiction to use the two words together. Now, when he said this, I had to chuckle. Notice how he gets upset when these polygamists use the word Mormon. And he wonders why we get upset when Mormons use the word Christian. See, there's a bit of irony in this. He finds that offensive, as we find it offensive when the Mormons claim to be Christian, even though their doctrines deny or distort all the basic tenets of the Christian faith. So you see him trying to separate himself from this group of what they call fundamentalists. Now, the problem, of course, is that polygamy is still a part of Mormon doctrine. It's just not practiced the same way as it was in the 19th century. In other words, what this means is you are allowed as a Mormon male to have more than one wife. You can be sealed for eternity to more than one woman. You just cannot have two living wives. That would be illegal, and you would be kicked out of the Mormon church if it became known. But here's how they still practice it, and this legacy is still going on. It's called celestial or eternal polygamy in the Mormon church. This is from a church handbook for stake presidents and bishops. Came out in 2010 in page 20. Notice what it says. Sealing of living members after a spouse's death. Women. For women, a living woman may be sealed to only one husband.
Even if he's dead?
Yes. But men, if a husband and wife have been sealed and the wife dies, the man may have another woman sealed to him if she is not already sealed to another man. That's the stipulation. If she was already sealed to another man and her husband died and she gets remarried, they would consider that sealing for time only. She would live as a wife to that man. It would not be for time and eternity. That's very important. You have to understand that in Mormonism, because they do believe they're going to be married throughout eternity, just as they believe that their God, Elohim, is married to Heavenly Mother for eternity. Well, in the 19th century, it was Heavenly Mothers. See, they don't emphasize the plural aspect of it anymore, because plural marriage is certainly not something they want to brag about right now, okay? But this is the way it's set up right now. So this means that a Mormon male, if his wife was to die, that he was sealed for in time and eternity, if she was to die, he could get remarried, and if she was not already sealed to another man, he could be sealed to her and have every hope of being married to both women in the next life. Does that make sense? I know it sounds a little confusing, but you have to understand that as we go on here. Now, right now, that is causing a lot of consternation among Mormon women, primarily the younger Mormon women. I was at a Sunstone Symposium in Salt Lake City. It was held up at the U, the University of Utah. We call it the U. There's the U and the Y. Okay, the U and the Y. And the U don't like the Y, and the Y don't like the U. You know what the Y is? Brigham Young University, BYU. Okay, that's the Mormon school. Well, anyway, I went to this symposium, and I listened to an author by the name of Carol Lynn Pearson. She wrote a book called The Ghosts of Eternal Polygamy, and it was basically a compilation of emails and letters that she had received from Mormon women that were very concerned about this idea that their husbands, if they were to die, could marry another woman and be sealed to them if that woman was not already sealed, and that they would have to share their husbands throughout eternity. And this causes a lot of angst among a lot of Mormon women. And it was heartbreaking to listen to some of the stories that she was telling, especially the Q&A by some of the women that were in the audience. This room was the biggest room. It was in the Student Union Center, and it's the biggest room in this building, and it was packed out. Well, it was interesting because Carol Lynn Pearson's argument, or response I should say, to this was, we need to somehow put kind of a pressure on the leadership to change this doctrine. And I'm sitting there going, that ain't happening. There's no way that's going to happen. This isn't like the changing of the priesthood with those of African heritage that goes from that point forward. This would be a doctrine that would have to go forward and backward. What do you do with all the men who were sealed to all these women? What would you do with Brigham Young's wives? What would you do with Joseph Smith's wives? All of a sudden they're not married anymore? See, that causes all sorts of problems in the hereafter. Well, here's why it could never happen. At the time she said that, Thomas S. Monson was still the president. But this man was waiting in the wings, Russell M. Nelson. There was also this man, Dallin H. Oates, who was an apostle at the time. Thomas S. Monson dies in January this year. So, as custom in the Mormon Church, the first presidency is dissolved. The senior member of the Quorum of the 12 now becomes the president. That's Russell M. Nelson. Russell M. Nelson, he married Dansell White on September 9th, 1924. Dansell White passes away in February 2005. On the 6th of April, 2006, he was sealed to Wendy L. Watson in the Salt Lake Temple for eternity, time and eternity. So what does the handbook say? He can marry another woman, be sealed to another woman, if she was not sealed to another man. She was not sealed to another man. Technically, he's going to be a polygamist in the next life. When he becomes the president, he has the choice of who are going to be his two counselors. He releases Dieter F. Uchtdorf, who had been second counselor under Thomas Monson, and he selects as his first counselor Dallin H. Oates. Dallin H. Oates was sealed to June Dixon on June 24th, 1952 in the Salt Lake Temple. She dies in 1998. On August 25th, 2000, Oates was sealed to Kristen McMain. It's that lady right there. Speaking at a BYU devotional in 2002, Oates said, "When I was 66, my wife June died of cancer. 2 years later, I married Kristen McMain, the eternal companion who now stands at my side." My question is, what a surprise to June. Imagine, when Dallin Oates dies and Kristen McMain dies, June's got to move over and share her husband with...
I don't think she has to worry about that.
Yeah, that's the whole point. I know. I don't think she has to worry about it because, of course, Mormonism isn't true. But if it was true, this is what would happen. As well as Dansell White would have to move over for Wendy Watson. And you have to wonder, what would they think about that? I don't know. Now, this has been going on for a while. This is nothing really new. They came out with a manual. The Mormon Church came out with a manual called Teachings of Presidents of the Church. On page 7, this is what it says about Joseph Fielding Smith, the 10th president. Eventually, Louis Shurtleff and Joseph discussed marriage. On the 26th day of April, 1898, we went to the Salt Lake Temple and were married for time and eternity. Page 15 of the manual. Ethel, her original name was Georgina Reynolds. That's how she was known. Now, I might mention, notice Reynolds? Remember I told you earlier about George Reynolds? This is his daughter. Okay? This is his daughter. Reynolds was the one that was convicted of unlawful cohabitation in 1879. Ethel and Joseph were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple on November 2nd, 1908. Page 22, it says, the two, Joseph Fielding Smith and Jesse Evans, were sealed in the Salt Lake Temple on April 12th, 1938. Technically, Mormonism teaches that Joseph Fielding Smith will be married to these 3 women throughout eternity. Now, I wonder how many Mormons reading this in the manual caught all that. Did they put all those pieces together? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But certainly, this is something that is taught in the Mormon Church today. Now, the question is, has polygamy stopped? All right. This is on the official website, mormonnewsroom.org, for May 31st, 2006, under the title Polygamy, Questions and Answers with the Los Angeles Times. The question is raised, is polygamy gone forever from the church? Well, here's the answer. You tell me. We only know what the Lord has revealed through his prophets, that plural marriage has been stopped in the church. Anything else is speculative and unwarranted. Does that sound kind of like an open-ended answer? It's been stopped how? Well, it's only been stopped as far as a man cannot have 2 living wives. But it really hasn't been stopped. It hasn't ended. It's just kind of changed or morphed into being practiced a little bit differently than the way it was in the 19th century. Then there's this book written by BYU professor Jesse L. Embry called Setting the Record Straight, Mormons and Polygamy, page 108. This is what it says. To understand polygamy, we must accept that God speaks to man and that his commandments are important. However, it is always difficult to know whether such promptings are from God or from a person's own desires. I love that. It's so classic, because how do Mormons know what's really from God and what's a man's desires. The men, of course, being the leaders even of the Mormon church. How would they know? Well, Mormons are told that when certain things come down from the leadership, they're to be accepted as a commandment from God. But even Mormons sometimes, I find, in talking to them one-on-one, question whether or not those things are really teachings from God. So it's a very confusing thing, but that's basically where we are. I like to throw this quote in because polygamy seems to me, at least, certainly fits the bill of what makes a false prophet. Russell Ballard, he's a Mormon apostle, gave a talk called Beware of False Prophets and Teachers, and notice how he describes a false prophet and teacher. False prophets and false teachers are also those who attempt to change the God-given and scripturally based doctrines that protect the sanctity of marriage, the divine nature of the family, and the essential doctrine of personal morality. So you would think by his own definition, Joseph Smith would be somewhat of a false prophet under that definition. So anyway.
How would the Mormons know if one of their new people came up and said, I've gotten this revelation from God that polygamy is okay?
Well, that technically could happen. I don't see it possibly happening in recent years, but it most certainly could. And if they did do that, then yeah, things would change. Things would change because they do have that kind of authority in the Mormon Church.
If it was against the law.
Well, that's why I probably don't see it happening, because it is against the law. And the Mormons, they do say in their articles of faith that they believe in being subject to the laws of the land, even though during polygamy they weren't being subject to the laws of the land, because the Moral Act of 1862 basically said they weren't supposed to be practicing it. And so, yeah, that's the confusion that belongs to this religion. So, any other questions? I'll let you out because
Does the rank and file believe this?
Well, when you say this, how much of this do you mean?
the polygamy in heaven?
I've talked to a lot of Mormons who do believe it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have. I've talked to some who don't like it. So, but it is a doctrine in the church. There's no escaping it because it is in the handbook. So, Phil.
With the current bleeding in the Mormon Church, with their, their rising infection within the church and so forth, how big a part is information on polygamy playing in that? Your estimation.
You mean, does the issue of being open more about their polygamy, how's that affecting the membership?
Yeah. Is that increasing defections?
No, it's certainly decreasing affections for the church.
Defections.
Oh, okay. I think it is affecting the defections because I can give you an example. It just happened recently with me. I volunteer at Sanders Bookstore, the Utah Lighthouse Bookstore in downtown Salt Lake City. And a week or so ago, I had a couple come in the probably late 60s, maybe early 70s. And the reason why they had just come out of the Mormon Church, she told me it was because of the Gospel Topics essay, specifically because I asked her, I says, was it the one on polygamy? And she smiled and said, yes, it was polygamy. She had never known that before. And when she read that her church was actually defending this and saying things that she had always thought as a Mormon were lies made by outsiders, she was highly offended, and that's what really started her journey out of the Mormon Church. So yes, I see it having a very negative effect on a lot of members, and that's not just the only story. So the honesty that the Mormon Church is coming out with, and I might say the honesty it's certainly not transparent, it's more opaque, okay? They're kind of being a little more open about it, but they're not telling the total truth. As I showed you from that paragraph. That paragraph's very, very misleading in the statement that came out in 2013. But they have no choice but to be a little bit more honest about this, and their honesty, at least as much as it is certainly causing a lot of problems with the membership. But I'll tell you this, so it's given people like myself and Sandra and others, it's given us a lot of street cred because we've been saying this stuff for years. And Mormons are recognizing this. I remember getting a phone call from a Mormon. Well, I've gone to the Mormon apologetic groups. And now I want to know what you have to say about it. This is what the guy says to me on the phone. He says, I want to know what you have to say about this, because I don't trust those guys anymore. And so the fact that he is now willing to trust us, that's quite a milestone when you think about it.
It may be interesting to see where this goes in the years ahead,
Yeah.
legally, with the affirmation of gay marriage and so forth.
Yeah, that's going to be a real interesting test for the Mormon Church. There's really no theological reason why the church can embrace same-sex marriage, because marriage and heaven go together in Mormonism, true, but it's for the reason of procreation.
Yeah.
That's the whole reason for it, is procreation.
But I mean, with the approval of same-sex marriage, the Mormons will now argue they could, well, why can't we have polygamy? We have same-sex.
Well, exactly, because if they do go with that, the moral high road certainly is gone. There is no moral high road any longer, so why not go with that? In fact, a lot of people argue that polygamy makes much more sense than same-sex marriage. At least the plumbing works, okay? So there's a lot of reasons to go more into that direction. So that is a challenge. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. So anyway, let me close in prayer, and I'll let you go, and we'll catch the plenary session with Sandra speaking this morning. Father, we thank you for all the many opportunities that we have had to minister to those who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We thank you for all those that have come out and have embraced our Lord as Savior. Our prayer is certainly for all those who have come out of the Mormon Church and drifted off into agnosticism or atheism, which sadly happens far too many times. But we pray that we might be able to use this information in a way to open the eyes of Latter-day Saints to see the error of their faith. And in our prayer, we pray that they would be turned to your gospel, the true gospel of the New Testament. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.